Hi folks. Oh gosh, I have to follow that. And everyone's tired too. We'll see how it goes. Brilliant. So I'm going to be talking about neck rings. My sort of working definition of a torc for the context of this is a sort of a rigid or a semi rigid neck ring. We can sort of argue about where the line between that and a necklace is. Feel free to bring that up in the questions. So if I say torc, you're probably thinking about something like this, probably thinking about something nice in Iron Age. And why not? They're lovely. They're made out of gold, sometimes found in vast quantities, as famously, but not exclusively, at Sletisham in Norfolk. And they seem to be a really, really important social symbol in the Iron Age, but not only in terms of Iron Age societies, but in terms of how, for example, the Roman world envisaged Iron Age societies in the Northwest. So there are lots of classical accounts of, barbarian naked warriors with their torcs and these sorts of things. And perhaps reasonably, perhaps unsurprisingly, because of all these things, a lot of the scholarship on them is firmly rooted in Iron Age studies. It's rooted on people who work on Iron Age material culture, people who work particularly on that narrow subset of Iron Age material culture that we call Celtic art, which is a sort of a well-defined, but perhaps shouldn't be, subset of objects. But the fact is, there's actually bloody loads of these things that date to the Roman period in Britain. And we do odd things, like we call them late Iron Age, even when they're 2nd century AD, which is kind of fine as a chronological label, but I think it does lead into this sort of like odd division that we create and reify between these sort of objects of Iron Age descent, as it were, and contemporary Roman material culture. And it's actually interesting that there are lots of really great works that deal with Romano-British dress, and these appear in hardly any of those, apart from as a sort of a precursor. There are individual ones, obviously published within site reports. There are, I suppose, studies that deal directly with these, particularly within the context of work on Celtic art, but they're very rarely fully integrated into discussions of dress in the Roman period. So what I'm going to try and do is move along a project that a few different scholars have been doing of trying to start that process. I'm particularly going to focus on stuff from the south of the province, so this is away from the frontiers largely, although I will talk about a bit of frontier material, really to show quite how ubiquitous this stuff is. I'm also just really trying to make everyone think about torcs as something that we might encounter in Roman assemblages, because I think there are bits of them out there and we're not necessarily identifying them. And then I'm going to come back to why they are interesting and what their social significance might be. So enjoy your last look at the gold torcs. You won't see many more as we go through, because basically by the end of the 1st century BC, the large-scale deposition of gold torcs mostly seems to have ended in Britain. And this is a real phenomenon, and there's this very evocative passage in Martin Hennig's The Heirs of Verica. He sort of contrasts Verica as this torc-wearing figure, whereas Togni Douglas, who's the new guard, who's probably built into this sort of client king sort of relationship with Rome, is wearing Roman military dress and expressing his power using similar materials, gold as well, but within a very, very different set of symbols. And of course, Martin's absolutely right in identifying these sorts of trends. We could argue about exactly when that's happening, whether it's back in the 1st century BC or around the time of the Claudian invasion. But there's good sort of evidence that underscores all this. So we see obviously changes in southern England in the forms of gold dress accessories in the 1st century BC and the early 1st century AD, with much stronger Roman and continental influence. Here on the Areopagus, we get a sense perhaps of torc through Roman eyes. And these figures, who are quite debated, but a lot of people see as barbarian obsides. So these are sort of hostage children, as it were, from barbarian communities is wearing a torc, which marks them out as a sort of northwestern European barbarian, possibly, and being sort of patted on the head paternalistically by the Romans. And then, of course, Romans are also appropriating the symbol of Torc in another way as well. So currently at the British Museum, this wonderful tombstone from Bonn, where Marcus Caelius is wearing 2 torcs hanging around his neck, or rather on his breast rather than on his neck, which are military awards. They're basically derived from the seizure, ultimately from the seizure of torcs from defeated northwestern European tribes. So there's quite a lot going on here in terms of how the symbol of the torc might be seen through different lenses at this time. We're seeing this increased emphasis on, I guess, a Roman perspective, perhaps, on these things, especially amongst the elite. And I think that's probably quite an important part of why gold torcs in particular might disappear from the archaeological record around this time. There are other important issues such as increased use of coinage and things like that, but I'm not really going to focus on that today. So that's one perspective, but then, you know, at the same time, they do pop up. So famously in Cassius Dio, his account of Boudicca, which of course is quite tropey, but we have Boudicca described as wearing a big gold torc. And here in Lindsay Allison-Jones' reading of this, she says, you know, this is not classic female dress of the period. So this is almost Boudicca taking on an older social identity, sort of reinvigorating perhaps earlier social identities. And also, I think it's not explicit here, but I think there's a suggestion here, potentially a male social identity she's taking on as a warrior. Or on the tombstone of Regina, which actually is also in the British Museum at the moment in the Legion exhibition. You could argue about this, but Maureen Carroll sees, and I agree with her, that this woman from southeastern England is wearing a torc as well. This tombstone probably dates to the 2nd century AD. But again, Maureen Carroll says, but there aren't any torcs around during this period. So is this like a symbolic looking back to the past? Well, maybe, and I completely agree that these are symbolically charged objects, but there are loads. I've got, I think, probably about 160 torcs from Roman Britain now in my sort of growing list, or torcs or possible torcs, to be fair. Here are some of the famous ones. This is the hinged collar tradition, which is largely found in the southwest. These are big, showy things, curvilinear, Celtic art on them. In many ways, very similar in spirit to some of the earlier Iron Age ones. Really, really high quality, sophisticated metalwork going on. This tradition, like some of the others, are quite varied in style, and actually it's technology that ties them together. It's the way of making and fastening the torcs. They've all got these hinges at the back, as you can see there. Up in, I guess, sort of central Britain towards the northern frontier, long thought as a sort of characteristic part of the metalwork from that area, these beaded torcs, which have a sort of rigid hoop round the back, and either a set of beads strung individually or a sort of cast-in-one beaded section at the front, which have slotted in with mortise and tenon style sockets. Fraser Hunter's done a lot of work on these, and he's sort of, I guess, unraveling and teasing out some more details on this at the moment. But what's really, really clear, as particularly the impact of the portable antiquities scheme, is that the distribution emphasis is plummeting southwards. The vast majority of them are from the Midlands now. And in the north, they're largely from military sites where we might suggest that quite a lot of the people are highly mobile. So that's quite a significant point. Now, I am dipping north of the frontier for a second, because actually, if we're looking sort of regionalized, torquey shaped things, I think the recent discovery of this amazing ring terminal torc from Old Dearn in the Highlands, together with this wonderful brooch, it's made me sort of revisit the ideas that these massive armlets, which are this characteristic northeastern Scottish form of metalwork, may in fact meant to be looking like torcs. I think there's quite a strong visual connection there, and they're again emerging at about this same time in the mid-1st century AD. So if you start plotting this all together, you see the emergence of some pretty strongly regionalized patterns. This map is actually a bit out of date. It's based on Fraser's map of 2008, which I've sort of recolored up and added a few things, but there are more finds since I put this together. So regional identities or regional technological traditions is probably more reasonable to say, but they're doing slightly different things with the idea of the talk in different areas, different workshop traditions, different emphasis. Southwestern stuff, lots of Celtic art. The beaded talks, less so. There's actually only one or two that have Celtic art on them. And then possibly this northern tradition, which doesn't really have a lot of talks, so it's not in the archaeological record, but maybe draws on the idea, the visual idea of the talk, based upon sort of ring terminal talks we get in the 1st century BC at places like Snettisham. Oh yeah, so I put a big question mark in the southeast, where talks was just to be sort of conspicuously absent. And that really leads into this sort of narrative of talks being perhaps a sort of a frontier thing, or a thing that's related to sort of cultural resistance further away from the soft effete Roman South, which, you know, isn't necessarily a wrong narrative. But I think when you start looking at some of the social contexts that they appear in, it's clear that they are very much appearing within Roman context. They're appearing on forts, they're appearing in towns, as well as rural settlements and hill forts and these sorts of places. And actually, back in my sort of main stomping grounds in Roman London, there's a very famous early Roman burial, this one at Harper Road, which has a neck ring in. But because the decoration isn't swirly, it hadn't been drawn into that debate about Celtic art. And that's where some of these lines that we draw in scholarship can really cause problems. As this is a very interesting burial, someone who probably born before the conquest, and you know, is really part of this sort of peri-conquest renegotiation of ideas and identities. Lots of Roman material culture, probably lived in a Roman town, wearing a torc. And actually, I started chasing these. I've kept on finding them. In fact, there's loads of them. I've built a whole typology around them, which I published. Well, it's the 2021 volume, but it came out last year in the Papers from the Norwegian Institute in Rome. And you add that in, that actually fills a pretty big gap in that distribution. And there is still some sort of gaps, sort of Oxfordshire down into Kent, but I can't really talk about these in detail, but a colleague got in touch recently, said they found a bunch of iron talks from peri-conquest Kent. So suddenly we go from part of being Romano-British for at least some people in at least some places to, I think, part of being Romano-British for at least some people in most places, but perhaps in different ways with different regional variations. We can start to place these within their social context a little bit by thinking about what are the, you know, how do these fit into dress ensembles? You know, who are wearing these things and how? Well, my Baldock talks in the southeast have got miniature bracelet-sized rod ones at the top left there. And I actually think there's a very strong chance that this group of strip bracelets, which I know Edwin has worked on and Nina Crummy and other people have worked on, are really tightly tied into this tradition as well. The decoration is extraordinarily similar. They appear in largely the same place. This is 2 distribution maps on the right-hand side and at exactly the same time. For some broader context on that, we can also see other kinds of matching neck ring and strip bracelet pairings during this period, either because of matching decoration or contextual associations. So that's the Boveton burial from Wales, or New Hoard from Wiltshire, where you get hinged strip bracelets alongside the hinged collars. Things are a bit more complicated in that I'm going to acknowledge that you don't really get precious metal talks during this period, or not many of them. There are this sort of subset of gold and silver bracelets, though, which I think are important. I think Nina Crummy would certainly argue that at least some of these are like those talks that we saw hanging earlier, military awards. I think that's a perfectly reasonable argument in the case of the Colchester ones because of their particular hoard context. But all of these are found amongst from contexts where they're found with highly Romanized jewellery as well, these strip bracelets. So perhaps they've got sort of an intermediate significance, which is slightly different from the neck rings. Oh, but also this isn't just a one-way idea. You can see some of this Celtic art, so kind of coming in the Riada bracelet on the right-hand side there. So those are your big regionalized groups. However, there's a whole mess of other stuff, which I think people could do me a huge favor by keeping an eye out for. So these things basically look like bracelets. If you have a little bit of them, you will not be able to distinguish them from bracelets until you start finding them around necks of skeletons, as has now happened in a couple of instances. That one in the center at the top there is from a burial in London. The style directly below it, there's a burial at Dorchester, a child's burial wearing one around their necks. The size obviously is really important, and Ellen Swift's done some work recently on bracelet and neck ring sizes. I would say once you're above about 80 millimeters, you should seriously start considering this as a possibility, because about 60 is kind of classic adult wrist sizes. But if you fasten it, you can get something quite tight around your neck. But also, we're getting these big chunky Iron Age style Torcs popping up. That thing on the left probably looks pretty 3rd century BC to me, but from a early 2nd century context in London. I don't think it's a brand new thing. I wonder if it's maybe an heirloom. It very much looks like a continental Iron Age Torc to me. All of these other ones here are appearing in hoards that we can securely date to the 1st or 2nd century, although some of the hoards themselves are antiquarian finds, which complicates matters. So I want to think why suddenly we get this bloom in base metal Torcs. And I think one of the really important factors is not simply resistance to Rome, but actually it's encounters with other Torc-using communities within the context of the Roman Empire. So potentially we have a Gallic Iron Age heirloom circulating in Roman London. Mislabeled slide says the height of German fashion in Berkshire. It's actually from Oxfordshire. It's just reported on the Berkshire PAS. My bad. I checked earlier. This to me looks very much like one of these beads that you get on these Heimstetten type Torcs in Bavaria and areas like that. And there are a few other quite similar objects on the PAS that they're a little less convincing, but they're sort of in the same sort of world. And this shouldn't surprise us. You know, we've already mentioned Torcs used as military awards. We've got obviously the recruitment of people from these Northwestern societies into the auxilia. You know, some classic examples here of warriors wearing Torcs, including in Roman context, like his burial at Chassenard, the tombstone of Flavinus up at Hexham Abbey, where he's wearing a Torc. And on the frontiers, where we have Roman military tombstones, we start recognizing women wearing Torcs as well. So these examples are mostly from the Rhineland, apart from these ones on the right, which are both from Britain, Torc-wearing women amongst Roman military communities. I would argue this is a really important point of context, and we can actually start seeing perhaps this reflected in practice in terms of what people are doing with these things as well. So in the south of Britain, Torcs hardly ever appear in burials in the Iron Age, and we've got this sudden influx of them appearing in the mid-1st century, late 1st century AD, few possibly later, one or two possibly significantly later, but that's not my result, so I shouldn't talk about it. But exact same time in Bavaria, Luxembourg, you're getting heirloom Torcs, you're getting new styles of Torcs appearing in female burials. Wells describes this as people expressing conflicting identities in the process of change, recreating indigenous traditions several generations old. And I think that's sort of the sort of general framework that I think we can understand these things within. But they're not just harking back, they're doing new things with them, they're reinterpreting them through new lenses. So you do find these things appearing in hoards still, these mixed material hoards, some of which have almost looks like personal individual sets of ornament in, like the Lamberton Moor hoard, which has got 3 brooches, 2 rings and a Torc, or this new Wiltshire hoard, which I only put part of up because it's huge, where there's multiple neck rings, multiple bracelets, a whole bunch of brooches, vessels in both, or even things like the Bonn hoard, where on the other side of the channel, of course, where you have this set of idealized female personal adornment and these fragments of Torc just below the statue of Mercury there, and then on the right-hand side as well. So there are some common elements of practice in both hoarding and burials in which Torcs appear around this time. And actually, I think we can start recognizing a way that the religious significance of talks is being transformed during this period. So we already saw that Mercury statue in that hoard from Bonn. There's a couple of instances, and I think Katie actually referenced to these the other day, of these statues of Mercury wearing precious metal torcs. And in Britain, some of these are actually snake finger rings that are being used as the torcs, which of course from the sort of late 1st century onwards becomes an incredibly popular form of jewellery. In the centre there, of course, we've got the Snettisham jewellery hoard, which is famously full of snake jewellery. And below that, some things which just about could be tiny fragments of torcs, Iron Age torcs in it. I can't push that one too far, but the Upchurch hoard, an antiquarian find from Kent, again has snake jewellery and fragments of old torcs in it. Obviously, Mercury, 2 snakes, caduceus, it's a thing. I don't know quite where that's going yet, but I think there's an important point of religious syncretism here, and I think it might have an impact both on how snake jewellery is received in Roman Britain, but also perhaps about how, in the areas where you have snake jewellery, torcs develop. Because in the southeast of the province, where that sort of stuff is, I guess, most popular, that's where we have the sort of thin bulldog torcs like my ones, the slightly wimpier ones, the ones that you could wear as part of a good Roman dress ensemble, and depending on who looked at it, could read it as a necklace or could read it as a torc. Up further away, that's where you've got your big chunky ones in the west, further north, where this sort of imagery perhaps isn't becoming quite so prevalent. We're also seeing differences between the southeast, where we're getting tons of burials, and the north, where we're not, and where instead torcs are featuring within funerary contexts as tombstones. So there's some really complicated stuff going on here, but really interesting stuff. There are quite a lot of these. I think they need to be discussed alongside other Roman dress accessories. You know, huge variety of material. So I'm not suggesting that there is a single unified phenomenon here. And in fact, I think there are possibly regional trajectories emerging. But yeah, keep an eye out. And if you've got a talk, please get in touch. Let me know about it. Thanks to everyone who's helped me with this research so far. Thanks.